Now let's create our application. So I'm going to start by launching my console. I'm going to jump to the folder where I want to do my work, and I'm going to create a new .NET console app by typing in .NET new console-o graph console app. Now after creating the app, I'm going to run the following commands to install the Microsoft Authentication Library, the Microsoft Graph.NET SDK, and a few configuration packages to the project. So I'm going to jump into the Graph Console App folder. I'm going to say .NET add package Microsoft.identity.client. I'm then going to do the same thing but install Microsoft.graph. Then I'm going to install the Microsoft.extensions.configuration. I'm going to do the Microsoft extensions configuration file extensions. And then finally, I'm going to do the configuration JSON. Now that everything's been created, I'm going to launch the console app in VS Code by just typing in code dot. Now if VS Code offers you to install required assets to build and debug the project, if presented with this option, go ahead and select yes in VS Code. Now in our project, I'm going to create a new file here called appsettings.json. And in this file, I'm going to add the following to it. It's going to have a tenant ID and the application ID. We need to update these two values with the credentials or the details for the Azure AD app that we created previously in this demo. So I have that saved on my desktop. So I'm going to grab the application ID, and I also need to grab the tenant ID. There we go. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I need to create a new helper class. So what I'm going to do is create a new folder in my project called helpers. And in this helpers class, I'm going to create a new file called MSAL authentication provider.cs. And I'm going to paste in this code. Let's take a look at what this does. This implements the authentication provider, and it implements a couple methods. We have a constructor that we're setting up here for the authentication provider. And what this is doing is, make this a little bit bigger so we can see it, is that it's passing in a public client application, all the scopes, and the current username and password for the current user. That's going to be used to log in. When we go to get an instance of our authentication provider, we're going to create a new instance of it by passing in these values and handing it back. We're storing that locally as a singleton so that we don't recreate this multiple times. The task, the asynchronous task that's being run, or that we have defined here, called authentication request async, is going to obtain an access token, which we'll look at in just a second, and then it's going to set that access token to the authorization header for all of the requests that we're going to make. And then the method here that of the get token async, what this is doing is this is going to be looking at our client application, and it's going to go fetch a token. So it's either going to try and grab an account this way, and then once it grabs the account using the get account async, it's then going to try to obtain the access token. Once that's finished, it's then going to try to obtain the access token for the current username, working with the username and a password, storing that as a result here, and then it's going to return back our access token to the calling user. This is going to be used by Microsoft Graph. Now let's go back to our project. I'm going to go into the program file, and I want to add a bunch of using statements we have to the top of this file here. So these are all mostly for working with Microsoft Graph, working with Azure AD, and specifically working with the Microsoft Authentication Library as well. And we're also importing in our helpers. Now one thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to load in the settings from our app settings file that I previously created. So I'm going to add in another method here called load settings. And all that's going to do is use the configuration builder to load our app settings, which is going to fetch the application or allow us to access the application ID and the tenant ID that you can see here. Now the next thing I want to do is I'm going to add in another method called the create authorization provider. This method is going to create an instance of the clients that we're going to use to call Microsoft Graph. So you can see here we're setting up the client, we're getting the client ID, we're getting the authority. It's using both the values from our connection, our configuration object that we have in our app that we just added. And then we're getting a list of all the scopes or all the permissions that we're going to demand from Azure AD or that we want our access token to have access to. Then we're going to create, for our public application builder, we're going to create a new application using the following authority that we defined up on line 22. We're going to then create it and get an instance of the authentication provider that we can use. And once we've done that, we can then add a method to obtain the Microsoft Graph client. So here we're getting an authenticated Graph client, passing in the configuration, the username, and the password. We're using that method that we just defined a second ago to use our configuration, passing in the user's username and password. Now we have an instance of the Microsoft Graph client, and we'll be able to use that to call, make requests to Microsoft Graph. Now what I need to do is I need to fetch the current user's credentials so that we can sign in on behalf of that user. Our app can sign in on behalf of that user. This is using the resource owner password flow. So the first one I'm going to add is one to call read password. And this is going to prompt the user to enter their password into the console. I'm going to read it in as a secure string, but I'm not going to display it to the screen. I'm just going to write out a bunch of stars when it shows up. I need to do something similar for our username as well. So I'm going to add in another method for getting the user's username. Now, within our main method that you see right here, I'm going to add the following code to load the configuration settings from the app file or from the app settings file. So here we're loading our app settings and we have all of our app settings all defined. The next thing we need to do is let's get the credentials from the user using the methods that we've already defined, and we'll create a new instance of the Microsoft Graph authenticated client. So we're going to have them log in using or provide our username and their password, and we're then going to get the authenticated client from the user. Now, one thing we need to do is I need to go modify the permissions that we pasted in. So here in the create authorization provider, remember we had a permission that we defined, the user.read.all. So I want to go add in that one permission for the list of permissions that are going to be requested when I go to obtain an access token. So now let's go back to our main method and scroll up, and let's add in the following code. Now what this code is going to do is it's going to request all users in our organization. So it's going to do a request for users.request. It's going to execute that asynchronously, and then it's going to walk through and output the ID of the current user, their display name, and their email address if they have one. And it will also display the results of that as well. So let's open up the console and test our app. So I'm going to run the following command, .NET dev certs https trust. What this does is this is going to ensure that the developer certificate has already been trusted. So I have to put in my password for my local workstation. Missed it the first time, but we can see now the second time that we have the certificates are already present. And that's going to allow our application and any browsers to trust the certificates that we've installed. So now let's go build the application. So I'll do a .NET build followed by .NET run. This is going to prompt me to authenticate. So I'll put in my username, and then I'll go grab my password and I'll paste that in as well. Now, there we go. So we have a list of all of our users in our organization. You can see the ID of the user in the left-hand column, followed by their name and their email address, if I have it, in the right-hand column.